Hey, this is Dr. Corey Glenn with Blue Sky Bio, and in this video I'm going to be showing how I go about making a bone reduction guide and a surgical guide, but slightly different design. One that's going to orient directly on the buccal bone, so this one will be indexed into place directly on the bone of the facial, of the mandible or the maxilla, whichever you choose to do. So there's a couple of advantages to this, one being that you don't have to do as much lingual reflection, and secondarily I'll show you how I've changed the design on the surgical guide tubes to open this up where you can see better, you can get irrigation in better, and so we'll go ahead and get this process started. As you can see, this patient is dentate, but it's a non-restorable dentition, so these teeth need to go, and what I'll be demonstrating in this video is just how I went about doing it on the mandible. So with any kind of a bone supported guide technique, the first step is going to be that you have to segment the bone. Okay, so that's done if you go to panels using the segmentation and you do advanced jaw segmentation. I would suggest going on my YouTube channel and looking up the video I have for this, because it can be a really tedious process, but I've got some hacks on there that show how to expedite that process, or alternatively you could just go and outsource this to Lab Pronto or to Image 3D Conversion. Both of those services do a nice job and will help you get a good result. So we've got our bone segmented. And at this point, I'm going to turn off the CT view, and we can turn on our implants just to show you where everything is going to be. And as you can see, there's going to be 5 pins. That's kind of overkill, but I just wanted to show the process. So we'll put a bunch of pins in there, and then we've got 6 implants that are going to be going into the mandible. So the first thing that will be required is bone reduction, and so we're going to have to do that very precisely. And so in this particular video, I'm going to show how to do this entire process solely in Blue Sky Plan, and then I'll follow up with another video showing how you can add in some mesh mixer for an alternative workflow. Okay, so we've segmented the mandible, and what we're going to do, just big picture, is that we are going to turn off all of these implants and guide tubes except for the pins. So if I was to turn on the pins, we want those on because we want our bone reduction guide to be able to pin in place. We do not want the implant tubes on just yet. Okay, so the starting point of this is that we're just going to make a surgical guide over the top of this without any of the implant tubes on, just the guide tubes for the pins. So let's go to the guide panel. We're going to build this on the segmented mandible. We're going to use normal quality, check on all of those things. And one thing that I would recommend that you do is come up here in your guide panel and click on this gear. Now the typical guide thickness is going to default to 3, okay? Now bear in mind, this is going to be a one-sided object. It doesn't wrap around on the back, and so it can tend to be a little bit flimsier than a typical guide. And the concern is that going to break, as I'm trying to manipulate this and slide it under a flap. So what I would suggest is that if you're going to do this, bump your guide thickness up to 4 to 5 millimeters. Let's just go 4 in this example. The other thing that we're going to do is that normally the software defaults to removing the undercuts, right? Because it's got to have a path of draw. We don't want to do that here. We want to maintain all the undercuts because that's exactly how this guide is going to index straight on the bone. It's going to index into the bony undercuts. It's got to intimately fit against that jawbone. So we're going to say not to remove the undercuts, and everything else should be okay here. So now I'm going to go about drawing the guide. We come down here and hit Draw Curve. I tend to make this very over contoured from what it needs to be. I don't even worry about the nerve right now. I can just go right over the top of it. Let's go back to roughly second molar. You don't have to go too terribly far on the lingual because all of that we're going to end up cutting away. But don't really worry about right now being over contoured with this shape, because it's very, very easy to go back and trim this thing down and to cut away excess. But if you don't have enough of it, that's a much more difficult process to overcome. Okay, so make sure that your guide line comes below the guide tubes. Now we can edit this curve, and then let's create the surgical guide. Okay, here you see the resulting surgical guide. Again, all the undercuts have been removed. It's a huge, big, bulky thing right now, but that's okay. We're going to overcome that in the next step. So now what we need to do is turn on all of the implants and all of the guide tubes. All right. We also need to now pick what, and actually you don't need your pin tubes anymore. The pin tubes can be turned off. We're going to change to the Blue Sky Bio fully guided surgical kit, which is what's going to be used in this case. And we also need to now turn the transparency down on the green guide and the jaw. We need to be able to see what's going on underneath those. So the jaw is already made transparent. We're just going to do that to the guide as well. So now what you're seeing is the guide tubes and the implants underneath, and this is going to help us determine where to make these bone cuts. All right, so now let's go to the surfaces panel. We're going to come down here and there's a button that says cut all. This is the button that we're going to use. We're going to cut through both the jaw and through the surgical guide simultaneously. Now I do like to duplicate this segmented mandible because I always like to keep one version which remains untouched, and then the other we can turn into the reduced mandible. So I'm going to turn that one off, and this one I'm going to go ahead and rename it as the reduced mandible. Okay. So the two models, or whatever models that you have visible on the screen, in this case the surgical guide, which I'm going to rename as reduction guide, and the reduced mandible. Those are the only two files that I have visible on the screen. And if you come down to the bottom of the surfaces panel, you're going to see a button that says cut all. So we're going to use this button that says cut all. I like to start here in the middle. I like to make my bone cut right here, and then I'll spin it and do it at the side. Now, some people have done this as just one massive plane cut, and you can do that by adding a window. Okay, when you use the window function, what that enables you to do is to stretch this thing. You can make one gigantic window, which then is going to end up becoming a plane cut. But the reason I don't tend to do that is because I don't like an abrupt plane cut for my reduction, right? I like to really strategically locate that, and I like my jaw shape to end up as this smooth flowing shape. Okay, so while this is an option, that's not what I'm going to do here. I'm going to remove that, and instead I'll look at it from the lingual. It's very important that you do this from the lingual. I'll zoom in pretty tight. And our cuts need to be made between the head of the implant and the bottom of the guide tube, okay? Because obviously you need your guide tube sitting up above the bone, but your implants you still want to keep a little bit subcrestal, so we'll kind of make the cut right in between those. So now come to cut all, and remember it's going to cut whatever surfaces you have visible here. So I'll come in and go right in between these two. Not worrying too much about the neighbor. All right, there's cut number one. Now, you will get this error sometimes. It's going to say that the mesh processing failed. And what that's telling you is that when it was making this cut, there's some areas that it was unable to close the mesh. And in fact, I can see that right here. You see that the mesh is kind of transparent. You can go right through there. That's okay. We're going to repair that at a later step, so don't really worry about that right now. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to orient where I can see these tubes on the lateral side. Now, I don't want my cuts to be in different planes. I do want to keep everything smooth and flowing and not be changing planes. So I'll look at it from this direction, but I want to orient it where I'm flat with that previous cut. And now I'll come back and I'll make the cut for this side. Once again, you'll see you have these mesh cut failures. That's all right. One other thing to point out is that you are going to miss some of this lingual portion of the guide. That's all right as well. We're going to come back and take care of that later on. So now we just need to do the other side. Once again, I'm going to flatten this cut where I'm looking straight through it. I need to zoom out enough where I can see all of this. And now we'll make our final bone cut. So hit cut all. And that completes the fabrication of the buccal guide. All right. Now, to get rid of the little piece that we've got floating back there, I'm going to turn up the transparency so that you can see this better. All right. Here, you see that mesh cut failure. That's the thing it was highlighting for us. We'll fix that at a later time. What I want to do is now go about fixing any little sharp areas. This gives us the plane from which we're going to need to do the reduction. And I'm actually looking at this, and I think I probably need to go just a bit more right here. And so one more cut at this. And while we're at it, let's just go ahead and do one more back here by the third molar, just for good measure. Okay, I was a little premature there, so now we're really done with this. You do still have the lingual portion floating out here, so let's come up here to our objects browser and let's just click on the green reduction guide. And then if you go to the bottom, you'll see a button that says isolate. So I'm going to go and click on the part that I want to isolate, and that's going to make everything not touching this buccal guide disappear now. Okay, so here you see the final resulting bone guide. It's going to be pretty over contoured right now, but here's where we can now go back and start trimming on this a bit. So if I was to turn the transparency back a little bit more where I can see the nerve and such, we obviously want to stay clear of the nerve. So this time I'm just going to use cut. I don't want to cut all here. So I'm going to just come in and swoop up and over the mental foramen, given plenty of room. Come and do the other side as well. And that should take care of it. Okay, and if you feel like this is over contoured, remember this is just printed resin, so you can just grind on this, do whatever you want. The resin I feel like is going to be the most cost effective. There's no reason you can't print this in metal if you so choose, but it can be pretty pricey to do that. The advantage in metal is that you can keep it much more thin. So when I do it in metal, I'm usually going down to a thickness of about 1.5 millimeters. So the access really is nice with those. But it's personal preference, up to you what you want to do from here. Okay, so now we have the final bone reduction guide, and what I'm going to do is just go ahead and export this, file, export data, and I'm going to just export the reduction guide here. Okay, so that has been saved now, and now what we need to do is make the secondary drilling guide. Okay, so I like the idea of being able to use this same file that I've generated here, but just connect these tubes up. Remember, if this thing is pinned into place, that isn't going anywhere. And so it really does make for a very stable guide when you've got these things connected. Now, this I do find to be a little bit easier to pull this off in Mesh Mixer, so if you want to mix and match techniques, we can show that in the next video. But if you'd just rather stay purely within Blue Sky Plan, think of how could you insert an object that would now connect these tubes to this, right? Well, one thing that we could do is just insert a bunch of custom implants. So if I went up here to add an implant, I could choose a custom implant. And we want to use, we can start out with a length of 10, and that's probably a good starting point. But we probably want, if this is printed resin, a diameter that's about 3 millimeters. Okay, so now I'm going to click all right, and I'll just drop this into the case. And what I can now do is start connecting the guide tubes down to the surgical guide. So I'm going to drag this over until it just connects to this guide tube. Pull it down vertically. And then the other end of it just needs to be long enough that it connects in with the printed resin. Because what we'll do is we'll export all of this together, And in the process of exporting it together, whatever you have checked on at that time, and we're going to leave all these tubes, plus this guide, plus these connecting implants, we're going to leave those checked on, which is going to now turn them into a single STL. So you'll see when I get to that step. Now, to just move along, we're going to duplicate this, and I'm going to pull another one over here. And I'm going to connect each guide tube to my tubes, or I'm sorry, to the reduction guide. And I don't worry too much about the fact that this is sticking out. Remember, it's resin. When you print this, just grind that off if it annoys you. But there's no reason that can't just stay there. So duplicate again. Okay, so now you see I've just repeated that process of duplicating and then orienting these custom implants to where they connect both the tubes up here as well as the guide down here. You do want to be careful that you're not impinging onto the internal of this. So as you can see right here, that one is going to be problematic because that's going to interfere with the bone reduction. It's not going to be able to index properly. So we just take that one and we scoot it back a little bit. All right, so just be aware that that can be an issue that you need to address. Once again, if you need to print it and then just grind that back a little bit, that's an option as well. And then just for stability's sake, one other thing I would do is that I would connect each implant tube together. So let's duplicate again. Now here is where the length becomes a bit more of an issue. So if I'm in my implant list and I've clicked on this implant, I can change my length here of the implant, and let's change it down to about 6 millimeters because we obviously don't want to impinge into the internal of our guide tubes. So now you can see this is shorter. I can pull it to where it's just connecting. Now let's duplicate that. We'll shorten it again, this time maybe 4 millimeters. Just want it long enough to connect without impinging into the internal. So I need to go even smaller. Okay, so now we have everything connected. We have each guide tube connected to one another and down to this portion. Now the nice thing if you do metal is that you could probably just connect the implants together and then one on each end here, and that's really it. I mean, there's not much need to have any more strength because metal's so strong. But if in resin, this is a good option here. So now this is going to become our drilling guide. So what I need to do is export all of these surfaces that I have visible right now. You've already got your pin tubes, which are the same as the previous reduction guide because this is the reduction guide. And now we're just going to export all of these implants and all of those tubes. So now I'm going to go up to export data. By default, anything that you've got visible on the screen should be checked on when you go to this step. So we shouldn't have to do much. The reduction guide's checked on. All of these individual guide tubes and implants are checked on. So I'm going to export this and this one I'm going to call drilling guide. Okay, so let's open these up. Okay, and as you see right here, when we open this up, this now is a single STL. Now remember the mesh cut failures from earlier? Those need to be repaired. And so all we have to do to repair that is in Mesh Mixer, you can hit Analysis, Inspector. It's going to highlight for you what it sees as mesh errors. But now one of the things it sometimes highlights, and I'm not sure the reason for this, but it'll highlight some of your connectors. You don't want to get rid of those. So don't just hit Repair All because it'll delete those. Rather, come and just individually click the holes where there's a mesh error that needs fixing, like so, and now everything is watertight and this will print perfectly. We can just re-export this now as the drilling guide, and that will take the place of the original one that we had. And remember that we need to repair the original reduction guide as well. So let's pull it in here and repair it while we're at it. Okay, so you can actually see here, I apparently forgot to uncheck the reduced jaw earlier when I exported this, but that's fine because we need to save this as a file too, and we also need to repair it. So since I've got this open, I'm going to come over here with my select tool, and I'm going to double click on this jaw. The jaw is going to be by itself what's known as a face group, meaning it's, even though these are saved as one STL, that is its own surface within the STL. So if I select it all, I could come up here to now hit separate, and you're going to see it turns it into its own STL now. It's pulled that apart from the reduction guide. So let's repair that jaw because it's got some mesh cut failures here. Inspector, we can fix that. And now that's done, and you could save this as your reduced jaw. And I like to print these out. I like to have one that I can play around with the fit and really get dialed in what that's going to feel like on the jaw in a surgery. So I would suggest printing this, or even your original jaw prior to extractions, and that way you can kind of get a feel for what it's going to feel like to index this thing into place when you're doing that process in the surgery. And now let's repair the reduction guide, analysis, inspector. This we can just repair all of those. Done, export it, and write over your reduction guide. So that's the end of the process, and now you can see this is what's going to happen in surgery. You'll take this guide, which is going to fit really precisely. You'll be amazed at how well this just pops in, and there's no question about where this thing fits. It's not sloppy. You're not wondering if you're in the right position. There's only one spot that it can go. You'll drop this in against the jaw, trim it down anywhere you need to if you feel like the contour is excessive, and you'll just reduce the jaw down to the level of flat with this guide. Okay? Once you've done that, take this one out and put in your drilling guide. Because they are one and the same file, as far as this part, it's going to fit the exact same way. Pins will go into the same place, and you'll be able to now do your drilling. So these tubes, remember, are set up to accommodate the Blue Sky Fully Guided kit or whatever kit you want to use. And one additional nice thing is that historically when we did these, I would make just a secondary conventional surgical guide just on this reduced jaw, right? I would just now come back, turn my tubes on, and make a new guide on this. But the reason that I don't love that is because you had to be super precise with your bone reduction. And if you left even a spicule of bone high, what would happen is your secondary drilling guide would not fit well. In this case, you don't have to worry about that because there's a gap between these tubes. Everything's indexing on the buccal, and so if you leave a little piece of bone high, as long as it's not crazy excessive, it's not going to matter because the guide tubes are floating up and off the ridge. If you would like, you can always carry this around to the lingual. That's certainly an option as well. But this is a nice option, and I hope this was helpful to you.